And once I won that major, that last US Open, I spent the next 6 months trying to figure out what was next. I pulled out of a bunch of events. I didn't really feel like practicing, and slowly my passion for the sport just sort of vanished. You know, I had nothing left to prove to myself. I achieved every goal that I put out there for myself. It is not easy to retire at 31. In one respect, I was glad I was done. I didn't have to deal with the pressure, the stress of playing professional tennis.
September 8, 2002. Arthur Ashe Stadium erupts as Pete Sampras collapses to his knees, tears streaming down his face. He just won his 14th Grand Slam title, cementing himself as the greatest tennis player in history. Then he did something nobody expected. He vanished. No farewell tour, no big announcement, just gone. The man who spent over a decade dominating tennis walked away from millions in endorsements, refused every interview request, and basically became a ghost. Even weirder, he has a Twitter account created in 2009 that's verified, and he's never posted a single tweet. Not one. While other legends like Federer and Nadal stay in the spotlight, Sampras lives like tennis never happened. But to understand why he disappeared, you need to know the wild story of how he got there in the first place. Potomac, Maryland, 1971. A kid named Petros Sampras is born into a family of Greek immigrants. His mom, Georgia, literally moved from Sparta, Greece to America without speaking English. At 3 years old, Pete found a tennis racket in the basement and became obsessed. He'd spend hours smashing balls against the wall until his parents thought he'd lost his mind. In 1978, his father got a job in California's aerospace industry, and the family moved to Palos Verdes. Suddenly, this Greek kid could play tennis year-round in perfect weather. A pediatrician named Peter Fisher watched Pete hit at the local club and saw something nobody else did. Fisher convinced Pete's parents to let him train their son. What happened next changed tennis history. Fisher made Pete switch from a two-handed to one-handed backhand. Then, at 14, he completely rebuilt Pete's game from baseline grinder to serve and volley attacker. Pete idolized Rod Laver and wanted to play just like him. He turned pro at 16, ranked 893rd in the world. Within 1 year, he was ranked 97th. By 1990, he'd cracked the top 20, but nobody thought he was ready for anything serious. They were about to be proven very wrong. August 1990, US Open. This skinny 19-year-old ranked number 12 walks onto the court looking like he just graduated high school. First match, Ivan Lendl. The number 1 player in the world with 8 Grand Slam titles. Sampras destroys him in straight sets. The tennis world freezes. Who is this kid? Next up, John McEnroe, the legend himself. Sampras dismantles him too. By the finals against Andre Agassi, the stadium is buzzing. Agassi was the flashy superstar everyone loved. Long hair, neon clothes, attitude for days. Instead, Sampras unleashed a serve that Agassi literally couldn't react to. 120-mile-per-hour bombs with massive topspin that kicked up shoulder high. What made his serve special wasn't the speed. Andy Roddick would later hit 155 miles per hour. Pete's averaged 115 to 130, but the spin was different. John McEnroe called it the greatest serve he'd ever seen. Pete had unbelievable shoulder flexibility that generated twice as much spin as other servers. When the ball bounced, it accelerated 20% faster, forcing opponents to hit returns at shoulder height. His second serve averaged 85 miles per hour, with nearly 5,000 RPMs of spin. Most pros couldn't generate that on their first serve. At 19 years and 28 days old, Pete became the youngest US Open champion in history. But even in that moment, cameras caught something strange. No fist pumps, barely a smile, just a blank stare. That expression would define him for the next decade. Sports writers called him boring. British tabloids labeled him robotic. Fans complained he had zero personality. Tennis was entering the entertainment era, with Agassi wearing wild outfits and McEnroe throwing tantrums. Pete showed up in plain white shorts looking like a gym teacher. While everyone else put on a show, Pete just served aces and walked to the other side. Zero celebration, zero emotion, zero entertainment. One journalist wrote that watching Pete play was like watching paint dry. Another said he had the charisma of a wooden plank. The media begged him to show emotion, to trash talk, to give them anything. His response? Nothing. He'd win Wimbledon, give a 2-sentence interview, and disappear. The hate got brutal. People compared him to Agassi constantly, and Pete always came up short in personality. Agassi was the rebel with rock star girlfriends and Nike commercials. Pete was the guy your parents wanted you to be. But Pete didn't care about being liked. He cared about winning. By 1993, he became world #1 and finished as year-end #1 for 6 straight years. That's an open-era record that still stands. While everyone complained about his personality, Pete was building the most dominant career tennis had ever seen, but everything was about to be tested by a rivalry that would define a generation. Pete Sampras versus Andre Agassi, the ultimate contrast. Agassi was the showman with long hair and flashy clothes. Pete was the silent assassin in boring shorts. They played 34 times over 13 years, and Pete won 20 of those matches. But this rivalry went way deeper than tennis. These two genuinely didn't like each other. In 2009, Agassi released his autobiography and torched Pete. He admitted he envied Sampras and hated how uninspiring Pete was. Agassi wrote that Pete represented everything wrong with tennis: the old guard, the boring style, zero personality. He said watching Pete win felt like a loss for the sport, but it got messier. In 2010, years after both retired, they played a charity match that was supposed to be friendly. Agassi started mocking Pete in front of the crowd, calling him cheap and saying he never tipped at restaurants. The audience laughed. Pete didn't. Instead, he fired a serve directly at Agassi's body at full speed, not near him, at him. The crowd went silent. These two legends had unresolved issues that went beyond tennis. For over a decade, their matches were must-see TV because you could feel the genuine dislike. Every time they faced each other, it felt personal. Despite the tension, both eventually admitted they respected each other's game. But for years, this rivalry was hostile and produced some of the greatest matches in tennis history. But nothing could prepare anyone for what happened in January 1995. Australian Open, January 1995. Pete's coach, Tim Gullickson, wasn't just a guy holding a clipboard. Tim was his mentor, his closest friend, practically family. Then came the news that shattered Pete's world. Brain tumor, inoperable. Tim had to fly back to the States immediately for treatment. Pete was devastated but tried to keep playing. In the quarterfinals against Jim Courier, Pete was getting destroyed, down 2 sets to love, barely able to focus. Then, in the middle of the 3rd set, it happened. Pete just broke. Right there on court, in front of thousands and millions watching on TV, tears started streaming down his face. He couldn't stop them. He served while crying. He returned shots while sobbing. The cameras zoomed in, and the whole world watched this emotionless robot finally show he was human. A fan screamed, "Do it for your coach." Something in Pete snapped. Still crying, barely able to see, he started playing the tennis of his life. He came back from 2 sets down and won in 5 sets. Every point was agony. Every game played through tears. After the match, Pete collapsed in the locker room and sobbed for an hour. The image became one of the most iconic moments in tennis history. The moment everyone realized the ice-cold champion was just a guy dealing with impossible pain. Tim Gullickson passed away in May 1996. Pete dedicated every match after that to Tim's memory. The loss became the driving force behind everything he did. And while Pete was dealing with that tragedy, he was also building the most dominant Wimbledon dynasty tennis had ever seen. Between 1993 and 2000, Pete Sampras didn't just win Wimbledon, he owned it. 7 titles in 8 years. The grass courts of center court became his personal kingdom. Boris Becker, a 3-time Wimbledon champion himself, said Pete took over the keys, changed the locks, and threw away the spare. That's not respect, that's surrender. Pete's serve was devastating on grass. The ball stayed low, skidded through, and opponents showed up already defeated. He won in 1993, 1994, 1995, lost in the quarterfinals in 1996, then won 4 straight from 1997 to 2000. His 1995 final against Becker was particularly dominant. He hit 23 aces and never faced a single breakpoint. But there was one tournament that tortured him, the French Open. Clay courts were his kryptonite. The surface slowed his serve and exposed weaknesses in his baseline game. He reached the semifinals once in 1996 and lost. It was the one Grand Slam that escaped him, and critics used it to question his legacy. Meanwhile, his rivalry with Patrick Rafter was adding drama. After losing to Pete at the 2000 Wimbledon final, Rafter told reporters they weren't friends and wouldn't grab a beer together. Pete was racking up enemies and trophies in equal measure, but nobody expected what was about to happen at the 1996 U.S. Open. September 1996, U.S. Open quarterfinals. Pete faces Alex Correggia, a A Spanish clay court specialist ranked 31st. Nobody expected this to be close. Instead, what happened became one of the most disturbing matches in tennis history. From the start, something was wrong. Pete looked exhausted. Corretja was playing the match of his life, forcing Pete into long rallies and grinding him down. Pete tried drinking Pepsi to settle his stomach. It didn't work. Corretja won the first set in a tiebreak, then the third and fourth sets. Pete was down 2-1, and the match was slipping away. Then came the fifth set. Pete was severely dehydrated, his legs were shaking, he could barely stand. At one point, he used his racket as a cane to stay upright. His face turned ghostly pale. The crowd of 23,000 watched in horror. The set went to a tiebreak. At 1-1, Pete staggered to the back and threw up on live television, vomit streaming while he tried to keep playing. The referee gave him a time violation warning and threatened disqualification. Pete wiped his mouth and kept going, still vomiting between points, barely conscious, legs wobbling. At 3-3, he served at 124 miles per hour, while vomiting and unable to stand properly. Corretja had match point at 6-7, 1 point from the biggest upset of his career. Pete approached the net, and Corretja hit a perfect passing shot. It was over, except Pete somehow volleyed it back. The crowd erupted. On the next point, Corretja double faulted, his only third double fault of the entire 4-hour match. Game over. Pete collapsed. Doctors rushed on and practically carried him off. They put him on an IV immediately. Meanwhile, Corretja sat alone crying. He'd played the best match of his life and lost to a guy vomiting on court. Pete later said, "This one was for Tim." That match became legendary. Pete went on to win the U.S. Open that year. For the next few years, Pete continued dominating. By 2000, he won his 7th Wimbledon, breaking Roy Emerson's record with his 13th Grand Slam title. His parents were there to see him make history. But after that, everything fell apart fast. He lost in the final of the 2000 U.S. Open. In 2001, he didn't win a single tournament for the first time since 1989. At Wimbledon 2002, he suffered one of the most humiliating defeats of his career. George Bassel, ranked 145th in the world, beat him in the second round. The headlines were savage. Pistol Pete is dead. The end of an era. Critics said he was washed up at 31. Heading into the U.S. Open, Pete had lost 10 of his last 16 matches. Nobody believed he could win. He was seeded 17th. Nobody thought he had anything left. He wasn't supposed to be a threat. He was supposed to fade away quietly. Then something crazy happened. Match after match, Pete started looking like the old Sampras. The serves were landing. The volleys were crisp. He bulldozed through the draw. Suddenly, people started paying attention. Wait, was Pistol Pete actually making a run? He reached the finals, and of course it was Agassi. Their rivalry had to end with one last battle. The crowd was electric. Two legends, both in their 30s, one final showdown. Pete unleashed everything he had left. 33 aces, 84 winners. At 31, supposedly finished, he played the best tennis of his career. He beat Agassi 6-3, 6-4, 5-7, 6-4. The final point was a backhand volley that Agassi couldn't return. Pete fell to his knees, sobbing. That backhand volley was the last competitive shot Pete Sampras ever hit. He didn't announce his retirement that night. He just walked off and never came back. He waited until August 2003 to officially retire. By then, everyone knew he'd broken Emerson's record and set a new mark at 14 Grand Slams. He'd avenged every critic who'd written him off, and then he just vanished. Today, Pete Sampras lives in Lake Sherwood, California, with his wife Bridget Wilson and their 2 sons. Bridget was a former actress who Pete met at a movie theater in 1999. They married in 2000 and both immediately committed to raising their children out of the public eye. Pete doesn't do endorsements. He doesn't give interviews. He doesn't show up at tennis events unless forced. His Twitter account sits frozen with 0 tweets. While Federer broke his record in 2009 and Djokovic and Nadal pushed into the 20s, Pete watched from a distance and said nothing publicly. No congratulations, no interviews comparing eras, just silence. In 2007, he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. He showed up, gave a brief speech, and left. That same year, he visited Greece for the first time at age 35. Despite being raised Greek Orthodox by immigrant parents, he'd never been. In 2010, many of his trophies were stolen from a public storage facility. The theft showed how private he'd become. He was storing his entire legacy like old furniture. Pete Sampras dominated tennis tennis for over a decade, set records, and walked away from all of it. In an era where athletes cling to the spotlight, do commentary and endorsements, Sampras chose silence. He won on his terms, left on his terms, lives on his terms. The greatest champion who never wanted to be famous. His 14 Grand Slams stood as the record until Federer broke it. Now the big three have pushed the numbers higher. But Pete doesn't seem to care. He's not competing for legacy points. He played his era, dominated his era, and moved on. The Pete Sampras story is about more than tennis. A kid from a Greek immigrant family who became obsessed at 3. A teenager who changed his game at 14 to chase greatness. A 19-year-old who shocked the world. A champion who played through tears after his coach's diagnosis. A warrior who vomited on court and still won. A king who owned Wimbledon for a decade. And a man who walked away from fame to live quietly with his family. Pete set the template for tennis greatness. He proved you could dominate without drama, without flash, without begging for attention. Just show up, serve aces, win titles, and go home. No social media, no reality shows, no desperate attempts to stay relevant. Just pure excellence, followed by pure silence. And maybe that's the most powerful statement of all. In a world that demands constant attention and validation, Pete Sampras chose to disappear. The greatest tennis player who wanted nothing to do with being great.